Have you ever looked at the person sleeping next to you and felt like you were staring at a stranger? Not because something happened that day, but because somewhere along the years the warmth just drained out and what remained was just two bodies sharing a roof, a bed, a life that no longer feels like life at all. Saint Teresa of Avila saw this emptiness. She did not see it the way a counselor might describe it in careful therapy language. She saw it the way God sometimes permits his saints to see hidden things, like a vision pressed straight into her soul. She saw husbands and wives who had become total strangers to each other, not through distance or death, but through something worse. They were still alive, still together, still going through the motions, but inside, nothing remained. No love, no warmth, no presence. Just two souls locked in the same cage, unable to touch, unable to speak, unable to feel anything but the cold weight of what they had lost. Teresa wrote about it in the Book of Her Life, chapter 31, in a passage that most people skip because it cuts too close. She is describing the states of prayer, the stages of spiritual union with God, and suddenly she stops. She makes a comparison so sharp and so painful that it feels like a scalpel slicing through pretense. She says that a soul separated from God is like a wife whose husband has abandoned her. Not physically. He is still in the house, he still sits at the table, he still sleeps in the same bed, but he no longer looks at her, he no longer speaks to her with affection. He tolerates her presence the way you tolerate furniture. And she, the wife, knows it. She feels it in every silent meal, every cold glance, every night where they lie next to each other like stones. Teresa writes it plainly. The soul that has lost union with God lives in the same spiritual house, but experiences none of the intimacy that makes life bearable. She says the soul still prays, still attends Mass, still performs duties, but there is no warmth, no closeness, no sense that anyone is listening or caring. God is not left, but the connection is dead. The soul feels what a woman feels when her husband will not even turn his head to look at her. If you value documented Catholic mystical theology like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the critical Spanish edition of Teresa's complete works, published by the Editorial de Espiritualidad in Madrid, particularly the annotated volumes edited by Tomás Alvarez and a friend de la Madre de Dios, along with scholarly commentary from Rowan Williams' Teresa of Avila and Gillian Algren's Teresa of Avila and the Politics of Sanctity. These are not popular devotional summaries. These are the academic texts used by Carmelite scholars who study the original manuscripts. Now, back to the information. Teresa knew exactly what she was describing because she had lived it herself. Before her conversion, before the visions, before the reforms, Teresa spent nearly 20 years in a state she later called lukewarm. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila in 1535 at the age of 20. She was sincere. She wanted to serve God. But within a few years, something went wrong. She became comfortable. She began enjoying the visits, the conversations, the social life inside the convent. The Incarnation was not a strict house. It was large, over 150 nuns, and many of them came from wealthy families. They had private rooms, they received guests, they talked about everything except God. Teresa fell into that pattern. She prayed out of duty. She attended the divine office because it was required, but there was no fire, no longing, no intimacy. She later admitted that for years she lived like a woman married to someone she no longer loved. God was still there, technically, but she did not feel him. She did not seek him. She was going through the motions, and inside, she was empty. This emptiness is not the same as temptation. Temptation comes with heat, with desire pulling you toward something else. Emptiness is colder. It is the absence of desire altogether. You are not drawn away. You are just not drawn. You sit in prayer and feel nothing. You sit at dinner with your spouse and feel nothing. The mind wanders. The heart stays flat. The person next to you could be anyone, and it would not matter because you have stopped caring. Teresa describes this state as worse than being attacked by devils. Devils at least prove that something matters. Emptiness proves that nothing does. She says that in this state, the soul becomes like a person wandering through a dry desert, unable to find water, unable to remember what water even tastes like. Memory fades. Hope fades. The only thing left is habit, and habit without love is a slow death. In 1554, something cracked. Teresa was 39 years old. She was walking through the convent oratory when she saw a statue of Christ covered in wounds, and for the first time in years, she felt something. She felt sorrow. Not for herself, for him, for the fact that he had suffered and she had not cared. She knelt down and started crying, and in that moment the ice broke. She later said it felt like waking up after years of being half asleep, like coming back into a room that used to be warm and realizing how cold it had been. But here is what most people miss. The warmth did not stay. It came in waves. For months afterward, Teresa would feel close to God, and then the coldness would return. She would try to pray, and the words would bounce off the ceiling. She would sit in silence, and the silence would feel hostile. She would reach for the presence she had felt before, and she would find nothing. She described it like trying to hold water in your hands. The harder you squeeze, the faster it runs out. This is where her comparison to marriage becomes devastating. Because in a marriage, you cannot just leave when the feeling fades. You made vows. You have responsibilities. You share a life, so you stay. You keep waking up next to the same person. You keep sitting across from them at meals. You keep sharing the same space. And every day, the silence gets louder. Every day, the distance grows. Not because of anger or betrayal, but because the connection that once held you together has quietly dissolved, and neither of you knows how to get it back. Teresa says this is exactly what happens to a soul in spiritual dryness. You do not stop believing in God. You do not reject the faith. You just stop feeling anything when you pray. The duties remain. The rituals remain. But the intimacy is gone. And because you are still performing all the external actions, people around you assume everything is fine. Your spouse assumes you are fine. Your spiritual director assumes you are fine. But inside, you are dying. She writes about a woman who came to her for counsel in Avila sometime around 1562. The woman was married. She had children. From the outside, her life looked stable. But she told Teresa that she felt like she was living with a ghost. Her husband was physically present. He provided for the family. He fulfilled his obligations. But he had not looked at her with warmth in years. He did not speak to her except to give instructions or make complaints. At night, he would lie beside her in silence, and she would stare at the ceiling, wondering how two people could share a bed and feel so completely alone. Teresa understood immediately. She told the woman that what she was experiencing in her marriage was the same thing many souls experience with God: the presence without intimacy, the duty without desire, the form of relationship without the substance. She said the danger was not that the woman would leave her husband. The danger was that she would stay but allow her heart to harden into stone, that she would stop hoping for anything better, that she would accept the coldness as normal and forget what warmth even felt like. The woman asked Teresa what she should do. Teresa did not tell her to leave. She did not tell her to confront her husband or demand change. She told her to pray, not for her husband to change, but for her own heart to remain soft. She said that in the absence of human warmth, a soul must cling to divine warmth, or it will freeze entirely. She said the woman needed to keep bringing the pain to God, keep naming the loneliness, keep refusing to let the emptiness become her identity. This advice sounds almost cruel. Why should the woman have to carry that burden alone? Why should she have to keep praying while her husband stays cold? But Teresa was not being cruel. She was being realistic. She knew from experience that you cannot force intimacy. You cannot manufacture warmth. You can only guard your own heart and keep it open to grace, even when every human source of comfort has dried up. If you value documented mystical theology and marital spirituality like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script draws heavily from the scholarship of Jody Billenkoff's The Avila of Saint Teresa, which uses Inquisition records and municipal archives to reconstruct the daily lives of women in 16th century Spain, and from the letters Teresa wrote to married women in her spiritual network, many of which are preserved in the Carmelite archives in Burgos and Seville. These are not generic devotional summaries. These are historical records that show how Teresa actually guided real women through real marital suffering. Now, back to the information. Teresa's own spiritual journey mirrors this pattern almost exactly. After her conversion experience in 1554, she entered what mystics call the prayer of quiet. She felt consolation. She felt God's presence. She experienced moments of union that left her trembling with joy. But these moments did not last. By 1559, she had entered what John of the Cross would later call the dark night of the soul. The consolations stopped. The warmth vanished. Prayer became agony. She would kneel before the Blessed Sacrament and feel absolutely nothing. Not anger, not doubt, just a blank, heavy absence. She writes in her life that during this period, she felt like a woman whose husband had stopped coming home. He had not divorced her. He had not announced his departure. He simply stopped showing up. She would wait in prayer the way a wife waits at the window, watching for a figure that never appears. She would cry out to God and hear only silence. She would open scripture and find the words lifeless, like reading a letter from someone who no longer cares. This lasted for years, not weeks, not months, years. Teresa says that between 1559 and 1567, she experienced periods of such intense spiritual dryness that she wondered if she had been abandoned entirely. She questioned whether her earlier experiences had been real or just emotional delusions. She wondered if she had done something to drive God away. She examined her conscience obsessively, looking for the sin that had caused the separation, but she could not find it. There was no dramatic fall, no betrayal, no turning away, just a slow, quiet fading like a fire burning down to ash. This is the terror of spiritual emptiness. It does not come with explanations. It does not announce itself. You do not wake up one morning and realize you have lost your faith. You wake up and realize you have not felt anything in months, maybe years, and you cannot remember when it started. The same thing happens in marriages. Couples do not usually decide to become strangers. They drift. They stop talking about anything deeper than schedules and bills. They stop touching, except out of obligation. They stop looking at each other with curiosity or desire, and one day they realize they are living with someone they do not know anymore. Teresa saw this pattern repeated in the lives of the people who came to her for spiritual direction. She saw husbands who stayed faithful to their wives but felt nothing. She saw wives who performed their duties without complaint but lived in a state of quiet desperation. She saw couples who attended Mass together, raised children together, grew old together, and never once experienced real intimacy. They were married. They were Catholics. They followed the rules, but they were empty. In her interior castle, written in 1577 when she was 62 years old, Teresa describes the soul's journey toward God as a movement through 7 mansions. The first 3 mansions are where most people live. They pray, they avoid serious sin, they participate in church life, but they experience very little intimacy with God. Teresa says most souls never leave these outer mansions. They spend their entire lives on the outskirts of the castle, never venturing deeper, never discovering what real union feels like. They are like people living in the servants' quarters of a palace, never realizing that the king has invited them into the inner chambers. She writes that the reason most souls stay in the outer mansions is fear, not fear of God's wrath, fear of intimacy itself, because intimacy requires vulnerability. It requires letting down defenses. It requires being seen. And many people, both in marriage and in spiritual life, prefer safety over intimacy. They prefer predictable distance over risky closeness. They prefer the cold comfort of routine over the terrifying warmth of being fully known. Teresa says this is why so many marriages fail without ever technically ending. The vows remain. The structure remains. But the soul of the marriage is dead. The husband and wife continue living together, but they do it from behind walls. They protect themselves. They keep secrets. They avoid difficult conversations. They settle for peace instead of fighting for connection. And over time, the walls become so thick that they forget there was ever anything else. She compares this to a garden that is no longer watered. The plants do not die immediately. They wilt slowly. First the flowers fade, then the leaves turn brown, then the stems grow brittle. Eventually, the whole garden looks dead, but the roots are still there underground. The question is whether anyone will bother to water them again, or whether they will just accept the death as permanent and plow the whole thing under. Teresa believed that no marriage is beyond recovery as long as both people are still alive. She believed that even the coldest heart can thaw if exposed to enough warmth. But she also knew that thawing is painful. It hurts to feel again after years of numbness. It hurts to hope again after years of resignation. It hurts to open up after years of closing down. Most people, she said, would rather stay numb than endure the pain of coming back to life. She told the story of a nobleman from Avila who came to her in 1564. He had been married for 23 years. He told Teresa that he and his wife had not had a real conversation in over a decade. They lived in the same house. They attended the same social functions. They slept in the same bed, but they spoke only when necessary, and even then, only about practical matters. He said he could not remember the last time they had laughed together or touched each other with affection. He said it was like living with a statue. Teresa asked him if he loved his wife. He said he did not know. He said he used to, back when they were first married, but the feeling had faded so gradually that he could not pinpoint when it disappeared. He said he did not hate her. He just felt nothing. He said looking at her was like looking at a piece of furniture, familiar, functional, lifeless. Teresa told him something that shocked him. She said that what he was describing was not a failure of emotion. It was a failure of will. She said love is not a feeling that happens to you. It is a decision you make every day. She said the warmth he remembered from the early years of marriage was not love. It was infatuation. Real love, she said, is what remains when infatuation fades. Real love is the choice to serve, to honor, to cherish, even when you feel nothing. The nobleman protested. He said he could not force himself to feel something he did not feel. Teresa agreed. She said he could not manufacture feelings, but he could manufacture actions. He could choose to speak kindly even when he did not feel kind. He could choose to listen even when he did not feel interested. He could choose to touch his wife with gentleness, even when he felt no desire. She said that if he did these things consistently without waiting for the feeling to come first, the feeling would eventually follow. She gave him specific instructions. Every morning before he left their bedroom, he was to look at his wife and say one kind thing, not a compliment about her appearance, something deeper, something about who she was as a person. Every evening, he was to ask her one real question and actually listen to the answer, not about the household, not about the children, about her thoughts, her fears, her hopes. And once a week, he was to sit with her in silence for 15 minutes. No conversation, no distractions, just presence. The nobleman thought this sounded absurd. He said it would feel forced and artificial. Teresa told him that of course it would feel forced. All new habits feel forced at first. A child learning to walk feels awkward and unnatural, but the child keeps trying because walking is worth the discomfort. She said that rebuilding intimacy after years of coldness would feel just as awkward. His wife might even resist it at first. She might be suspicious. She might think he wanted something from her. But if he kept doing it faithfully, without demanding anything in return, eventually the suspicion would fade. Eventually, she would begin to trust again. She warned him that it would take time, months, maybe years. She said it was like restarting a fire from cold ashes. You do not just strike one match and expect flames. You gather kindling. You blow gently. You protect the first tiny spark from the wind. You add fuel slowly. You stay patient. And, if you do everything right, eventually the fire catches, and the warmth returns. The nobleman returned to Teresa 6 months later. He told her that the first 3 weeks had been torture. His wife had looked at him with confusion every time he said something kind. She had answered his questions with one-word responses. She had sat through the 15 minutes of silence like a prisoner enduring punishment. But he kept going. And in the 4th week, something changed. His wife asked him a question. A real question. She asked him if he was happy with his life. It was the first time in years she had asked him anything personal. He did not know how to answer. He stumbled through a response. But the question itself was a spark. It meant she was curious again. It meant she cared enough to wonder. By the 6th month, they were having conversations again. Not long conversations. Not deep conversations, but conversations. They were looking at each other again. They were noticing each other again. The nobleman told Teresa that the warmth had not fully returned, but the ice was melting. He could feel it. His wife could feel it. They still had a long way to go, but they were moving in the right direction. He asked Teresa if this slow, painful process was what real love looked like. She said yes. She said the feeling people call love at the beginning of a relationship is not love. It is attraction. It is desire. It is the easy warmth that requires no effort. Real love is what happens when that easy warmth fades and you choose to rebuild it with your bare hands. Real love is the decision to keep gathering kindling when every part of you wants to quit. Teresa knew this from experience because it was exactly how God had brought her back to life. After years of dryness, after years of feeling nothing, God did not suddenly flood her with consolation. He gave her small graces, a moment of peace during prayer, a line from Scripture that struck her heart, a brief sense of presence that lasted only seconds. But she learned to notice these small graces. She learned to thank God for them. She learned to cooperate with them, even when they felt insignificant. And over time, the small graces grew. The moments of presence became longer. The peace became deeper. The intimacy returned. She told her spiritual children that this is the pattern of all spiritual recovery. You do not wait for a dramatic experience. You do not wait for feelings to arrive. You start with the smallest act of will. You open the Bible even though it feels dead. You kneel in prayer even though you feel nothing. You receive communion even though it feels mechanical. You do these things not because they feel good, but because they are true. And truth has power even when feeling has died. By 1570, Teresa had founded 5 Reformed Carmelite convents. She was traveling constantly, fighting the Inquisition, negotiating with nobles, training novices, and writing her mystical works. But in all that activity, she never forgot the lesson of the cold marriage. She never forgot the woman in Avila who felt like a stranger to her own husband. She never forgot the nobleman who could not remember the last time he felt warmth. She carried those stories with her, and she used them in her spiritual direction again and again. She wrote letters to married women all over Spain. Many of these letters are preserved in the archives. In one letter dated March 1573, she writes to a woman named Doña Luisa de la Cerda, a widow who was mourning the death of her husband. But the mourning was complicated because Doña Luisa admitted that for the last 10 years of her marriage, she and her husband had been emotionally distant. She said she felt guilty for not missing him more, but she could not force a grief she did not feel. Teresa responded with brutal honesty. She told Doña Luisa that the absence of grief was not a sin. It was a symptom. The marriage had died years before the husband's body did. The real tragedy, Teresa said, was not that Doña Luisa did not cry. The real tragedy was that she and her husband had wasted 10 years living as strangers when they could have fought to rebuild intimacy. Teresa told her that the lesson to take from this was not guilt, but resolve. If Doña Luisa ever remarried, she should remember what it feels like to live with someone and feel nothing. She should remember that intimacy does not maintain itself. It requires constant attention, constant effort, constant choice. She said that most people lose intimacy slowly, over years, because they stop paying attention. They assume the connection will last automatically. They assume the warmth will stay without effort. And then one day they wake up, and the warmth is gone, and they do not know how to get it back. Teresa said the same principle applies to spiritual life. Souls who experience dryness often make the same mistake. They assume that because they felt God's presence once, it will always be there. They stop working at prayer. They stop examining their conscience. They stop seeking deeper conversion. And then when the dryness comes, they panic. They think God has abandoned them, but God has not moved. They have. They drifted without noticing. They stopped paying attention. They let the fire burn down to ash. In her interior castle, Teresa describes what happens to a soul that refuses to address spiritual dryness. She says the soul begins to rationalize the emptiness. It tells itself that maybe intimacy with God is not really possible. Maybe the mystics were exaggerating. Maybe prayer is supposed to feel dry and lifeless. The soul settles for mediocrity. It convinces itself that lukewarmness is normal. It stops expecting anything more. And eventually, it stops wanting anything more. She says the same thing happens in marriages. Couples rationalize the coldness. They tell themselves that romance is for young people. They tell themselves that passion fades, and that is just how life is. They tell themselves that the best they can hope for is peaceful coexistence. They stop fighting for intimacy because they stop believing intimacy is possible. They settle. They resign. They accept the emptiness as inevitable. Teresa says this resignation is the real death, not the dryness itself. The dryness is painful, but it is not fatal. What is fatal is giving up. What is fatal is deciding that nothing better is possible. What is fatal is choosing safety over risk, choosing numbness over feeling, choosing the appearance of stability over the reality of connection. She writes that the saddest souls she ever encountered were not the ones in open rebellion against God. Rebels, at least, still care. The saddest souls were the ones who had stopped caring, the ones who went through all the motions without passion, without hope, without desire, the ones who prayed without longing, the ones who received the sacraments without hunger, the ones who lived their entire lives in the outer courts of the castle and never once asked if there was more. In 1582, the year of her death, Teresa was traveling from Burgos back to Avila. She stopped in the town of Alba de Tormes, sick and exhausted. She was 67 years old. She had spent the last 20 years fighting for reform, enduring opposition, writing books, founding convents, and pouring herself out for souls. On October 4th, she collapsed. She was dying. The nuns around her asked if she had any final words. She said only this: "Lord, I am a daughter of the church." She died that night. But in the months before her death, she had one final vision. She did not write it down. It was recorded by Anne of St. Bartholomew, one of the nuns who cared for her in her final days. Teresa saw two souls standing before the judgment seat of God. One soul had lived a life of obvious sin, adultery, theft, violence. The other soul had lived a life of perfect external observance. Mass every Sunday, prayers every day, no scandal, no obvious faults. The first soul was terrified. The second soul was confident. But when the books were opened, the judgment shocked both of them. The first soul was shown mercy. God said that though the soul had sinned grievously, it had at least felt something. It had desired. It had struggled. It had cared enough to fight, even if it lost. But the second soul was condemned. Not for sin, for indifference. God showed the soul a long life of prayers, spoken without love, sacraments received without hunger, duties performed without passion. And God said, "You gave me nothing, not even your attention." Teresa told this vision to Anne on one of her last nights alive. She said the emptiness was the unforgivable sin, not because God refuses to forgive it, but because the soul that has gone completely cold does not want forgiveness. It does not want anything. It has trained itself not to want. It has chosen safety over desire, numbness over pain, the slow death of routine over the terrifying risk of being fully alive. Anne asked Teresa if there was any hope for such souls. Teresa said yes, but only if they are willing to feel again. Only if they are willing to let the ice break. Only if they are willing to admit that the emptiness is killing them and to cry out for help. She said the crying out is the beginning of resurrection. As long as a soul can still cry, it can still be saved. In the Carmelite archives in Avila, there is a letter Teresa wrote in October 1577 to a married couple who had written to her in despair. They said their marriage felt dead. They said they had tried everything: counseling, retreats, renewed vows. Nothing worked. They asked Teresa if they should just accept that their marriage was over, even if they stayed together for the sake of the children. Teresa wrote back immediately. She told them that acceptance was surrender. She told them that as long as they were both alive, the marriage was not dead. It was dormant. She said, dormancy looks like death, but it is not. Seeds lie dormant in frozen ground all winter, and in spring they rise. She said their job was not to accept the cold. Their job was to prepare for spring, to keep the soil soft, to keep their hearts open, to keep choosing each other even when it felt pointless. She said that if they did this faithfully, one day the warmth would return. Maybe not the way it was before, maybe better, maybe different, but it would return. The letter ends with a line that has been quoted by Carmelite spiritual directors for 400 years. Teresa writes, "Do not mistake winter for death. The tree that looks dead in January is gathering strength underground. You do not see it, but the roots are working. Keep watering them." That couple stayed together. Their names are recorded in the parish registry of Avila. They lived another 32 years. They had 6 more children. They died within 3 months of each other in 1609. Whether they ever felt the warmth return, we do not know. But they stayed. They kept watering the roots. They chose life over resignation. In 1622, 40 years after Teresa's death, the church exhumed her body. She had been buried in Alba de Tormes. When they opened the coffin, they found her body incorrupt. No decay, no smell of death, just the faint scent of flowers. Her heart was removed and placed in a reliquary. When they cut it open, they found a deep wound running through the center, not from a blade, from fire. The mystical wound she had described in her autobiography, the wound left by the angel who pierced her heart with a burning spear, was still there, physical, visible, documented by witnesses and recorded in the canonization proceedings. The wound proved everything she had written. The intimacy was real, the union was real, the fire was real, but so was the dryness, so was the emptiness. So was the long, cold winter when she felt nothing and kept praying anyway. The wound in her heart was not just from ecstasy, it was also from endurance, from the years she spent reaching for a God she could not feel, crying out to a husband who seemed not to hear, waiting at the window for a presence that did not come. And then, after all that waiting, after all that dryness, the fire arrived. And it left a mark that even death could not erase. The church keeps that heart in a crystal case in Alba de Tormes. Pilgrims can still see it. The wound is still visible. 443 years after her death, the proof remains. Intimacy is real, but it costs everything. It requires endurance through the cold. It requires watering roots you cannot see. It requires choosing life when everything feels dead. It requires believing that winter is not the end. And for those who endure, for those who refuse to settle, for those who keep crying out even when no one seems to hear, the fire comes. And when it comes, it burns so deep that not even death can put it out. That wound was 17 millimeters long, measured by the physicians during the canonization inquiry in 1625. 17 millimeters. Cold, documented, still there.